No one ever warned me that a woman with wrinkled hands and a brown purse would be the person to save me. Hi, welcome. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It was a Friday night at the upscale riverfront bistro, the chandeliers catching the waterlight and folding it into 1,000 polite reflections, and she had come to celebrate what she believed was the safe end of a long, slow climb. Mara was 34, owned a small pottery studio, and taught ceramics to kids on Saturdays. And after a decade of tightening budgets and careful saving, she finally thought she could breathe. At the table across from her, James looked like a man who had never needed to prove anything. Neat suit, practiced smile, the kind of softness in his voice that suggested steadiness rather than secrets. They shared a quiet conversation about a lease he said he had finalized for them, about the keys he promised would mean a home, and Mara laughed at a memory he nudged out with a gentle joke. Then he stood to take a call that lasted only a minute, and an old woman from the next table leaned over and slid a small stack of cash into Mara's palm. Her eyes were steady, and her whisper was sharper than anything in the room. Call a cab and go to the ladies' room. Do not let him see you go. Mara thought at first that the woman was mistaken, that she had misheard the tone. In the next seconds, two men in heavy coats pushed through the restaurant doors and looked straight at their table. In an instant, the warmth of the night curdled into a logic Mara did not recognize, a calculation that had been playing itself out long before she ever met James. This was not a bad night. It was a hinge. Stay with me. I will tell you how a ledger, a notarized contract, and a single photograph turned a private betrayal into a public case that unstitched the life she had been building. The riverfront bistro had linen napkins and a maitre d' who knew most regulars by their appetizer preferences. Mara's weekend routine had often been the late morning sweep of clay shards from the studio, the midday shipment of glaze mixes, the evening teaching of teens who learned to center a lump of mud into something that could hold a drink. She loved the tactile, the slow reward of fired clay. James had entered her life like a soft current. He knew how she liked her coffee, how she arranged succulents on the shop counter, and he listened when she talked about clients who needed commissioned urns. In private, he was attentive. In public, he complimented her work and joked with neighbors. Mara remembered the first time he helped move a shelf in the studio. He whistled as he carried a crate of plaster, says he liked being helpful. She had a box labeled receipts and a slim photo album of the small celebrations she allowed herself. Her backstory was one of stubborn persistence. Her parents had died when she was 28, and she scraped to keep her rent paid and keep the kiln warm. She had a small network of friends who were also small business owners, 5 people who often came by with coffee or a spare hand. Lila the baker, who supplied her with leftover baguettes. Omar, the building porter, who smiled when he saw clay on her wrists. Sonia, the accountant, who balanced her tax forms. Ben, the journalist, who once wrote a friendly blurb for her opening. And Denise, the neighbor, who always brought houseplants. That was Mara's life, granular and honest, built on daily labor and the belief that a steady hand and modest customers could equal a secure tomorrow. She had reconciled with the idea that security comes in tiny installments, not large gestures. James's presence felt like a large gesture, and she liked the illusion of accelerated certainty. James had his own backstory, quieter and harder to read. He was 42, worked as a consultant to small municipal boards, and served on a volunteer committee that advised local housing projects. He often showed up at ribbon cuttings in a pressed jacket and carried a stack of business cards. People who met him described him as having a steady confidence, the kind that made others relax and reveal what they were worried about. In his youth, he had dabbled in finance, learning how to move documents and craft signatures that looked authoritative. He had a careful hand for paperwork and a taste for other people's trust. He kept his private life close, saying only what he thought would be useful and omitting what would complicate his image. That omission had protected him for years. Friends like David from the committee and Carla, the real estate agent, trusted his counsel. He volunteered at the community garden and liked to be seen handing out certificates. Behind that facade were patterns, frequent calls erased at night, a habit of signing for things before his partner read them, and a ledger he claimed was a personal expense notebook, but which, in retrospect, had columns that did not add up to mere coffee money. James's backstory explained how he could orchestrate trust without ever seeming untrustworthy, how he could leverage public roles to private advantage, and how the institutional respect he wore like a coat obscured the shape of his real intentions. The warning came like a foreign language slipped into her ear. In the restaurant, the light smelt of lemon and butter. The polished wood under the table felt cool, and the old woman's cash left an odd tactile warmth in Mara's palm. The woman said one sentence and then folded back into the anonymity of the other patrons. "Do not let him touch the contract," she said. Mara looked at James' feet moving across the polished floor. The man at the entrance glanced at them with a gaze that was not random. Mara's pulse thudded in the soft part of her throat. She had no idea how that whisper would become a map to everything that followed. She excused herself, voice shaking, and went toward the ladies' room. In the hallway tiles, she counted footsteps and tried to steady her breath. Inside a small stall, she pressed her back to the cold porcelain and read the note tucked beneath the cash the old woman had given her. It had an address scribbled, a name that sounded like a key, and 3 words underlined: "Notarized Contract Ledger." The phrase landed like a stone. She felt suddenly watched and suddenly armed with the clue. When she opened the stall door, 2 men were waiting by the sinks. One of them spoke, and his voice was casual, as if greeting a neighbor. "Everything okay?" Mara felt a flood of protective instincts evaporate. The men had the air of enforcers, of people used to a job that required physical presence. She backed toward the exit, and in that corridor, the first real ripple of terror braided itself with a clear instruction learned from the old woman: get proof, get away, and do not sign anything. The first trap that revealed itself was not legal but social. James, after that brief call, returned with a practiced look of concern and asked why Mara had left the table. She told him a version of the truth that felt safe, that an old woman had given her money and a warning. He smiled with a steadiness that suggested protective annoyances and guided her back to the table with a hand lightly on her elbow. "You get nervous about everything," he said, voice smooth. He leaned in and put his phone between them and said he had taken care of the lease, that the notary had confirmed everything, and that the bank transfer was already scheduled for the next morning. A waiter passed bread, and the scent of rosemary rose into the air. There were several short exchanges, 10 of them rapid and layered, that evening between Mara and James, and each one ended with James deflecting pressure enough to look helpful. "We can sign together tomorrow at the notary," he said. "You will feel better when the paperwork is final," he added. "I handled the deposit," he reminded her. "We will have keys in 2 weeks," he said. "Trust me," he said. Mara said nothing at first, and then tried to push for a look at the contract. "You will see it later," he promised. The conversations were punctuated by polite smiles from strangers, soft jazz from the speakers, and the clink of silverware, a sensory buffer that kept the restaurant from transforming into the scene of a crime, even as a crime was beginning. That evening, a pattern began to form, whereby trust was solicited with small acts, and reality was being reshaped by documents Mara had not yet read. The old woman appeared again 2 nights later at the community market, where Mara bought clay. She was bent but alert, wearing a coat patched in places with mending thread. Her name was Rose. Rose's voice had a tremor, but there was an iron edge beneath it. "You have to get everything notarized in your name," she said. "He will sign things, and he will put your name where it looks right, but it will not be yours." Rose had lived in that neighborhood for decades, had watched people come and go, and had seen men like James use civility as a cover. She introduced Mara to Omar, the porter, who had once watched a similar scheme unfold across the hall. Omar had a calm manner and an intimate knowledge of building comings and goings. He agreed to be a witness. Over the next week, the warnings piled into a chorus. Leela, the baker, brought extra bread and a camera memory card tucked into a paper bag. Sonia, the accountant, offered to check bank statements. Ben, the journalist, asked gentle questions. Denise listened and silently offered the spare key to her stoop. A network of small kindnesses began to form a safety net. Rose told Mara where to look for signs in James's files. Omar offered to install a simple app that recorded calls and time-stamped interactions. "You need a paper trail," Rose said. "You need to find the ledger." The first clear alarm came when Mara tried to transfer money for the deposit from her account, and the transfer failed. The screen on her phone blinked a message that said "account blocked." She called the bank and waited on hold, listening to music until her irritation curdled into dread. The agent told her that multiple transfer requests had been placed and one had been approved that morning for a large sum, but that her account had been flagged because there was a conflicting notary document lodged with another branch claiming rights over the lease. Mara heard the agent name a different signature, one she had never used, and the word notarized came up like a noiseless bell. "We will need original documents and a police statement," the agent said. Mara felt the floor of everyday life shift. She hurried to Sonia's office, and they went through 6 months of bank statements. There it was in black and white, a transfer schedule that did not match the payments she had expected. Withdrawals made in the name of a company she had never heard of, and a scanned contract with Mara's name on it, but a signature she did not recognize. The technical explanation was cold and efficient. The bank's security protocol allowed a notarized claim to freeze accounts pending verification. A notarized signature with matching ID presented to a branch could trigger a block while investigations took place. The procedural description that Sonia gave Mara was concise and brutal. When a notarized document is lodged asserting rights, banking systems place a provisional freeze and open an investigation. It requires certified originals, witness statements, and a formal dispute lodged at a branch and with asset protection. That process often takes weeks, and for the people stuck within it, the result is a sudden removal of access to funds and services. This is a moment where I ask you to pause and speak. If this moved you, you are not alone. Have you ever seen something like this happen in your city? Start your reply with "here" and tell us the city. Your comments help us map patterns and protect others. When people share where they are, we can start to see if a method is local or systemic. Your experiences matter, and they help others know they are not alone. Now back to the night that made everything visible. Public humiliation arrived subtly and then in a wave. James, by then, had arranged for a friendly neighborhood meeting at the small community center under the banner of settling a miscommunication about the lease. He spoke with calm authority about paperwork and signatures. He presented what looked like professional documents and mentioned that a notarized transfer was already filed to clear up the mess. He leaned into the room slight and smiled at neighbors who trusted him. When Mara protested when she said she had not agreed to sign any such transfer, James raised his voice only a little and produced a scanned copy on his tablet. He read from a page that looked stamped and official. "There are signatures and witnesses," he said. "We are simply correcting a clerical error." Someone in the back suggested mediation. A neighbor who had once bought a piece from Mara's studio whispered that she had seen James at the garden committee handing out flyers. As people talked, the atmosphere shifted from polite concern to a cold calculus. A local blogger named Anya quoted James's version and posted it with a headline that suggested Mara was irresponsible. And a few hours later, the comment threads were full of opinions based on a single side of the story. The procedural machinery of reputation moved faster than the legal machinery of truth. A landlord called Mara and said he could not afford to wait while documents were disputed. She found herself pushed toward the doorway of eviction by rumors and a notarized page. The human cost was immediate. Leela lost a weekly client because rumors spread through the bakery. Ben, the journalist, hesitated to publish a sympathetic piece until he could verify documents. The sense of being publicly judged for a crime she did not commit was a new kind of violence. The old woman's cash had been a warning and a ticket to a longer fight. Inside the community center, a scene unfolded with a high density of dialogue, each exchange sharp and revealing. "You signed," James insisted, showing a tablet. "I would never do that," Mara said. "Then the notary has a record," he replied. "We can show it tonight," he said to the others. "It looks legitimate," said Carla, the real estate agent. "Have you seen the notarization stamp?" asked a neighbor. "Who witnessed it?" Sonia asked, voice tense. "We have witnesses," James replied. "I do not know these signatures," Mara said. "They are mine only in print," she said. "We need a copy of the ledger and the original notary," Sonia argued. "If someone is forging signatures, that is a crime," said Omar. "We will get a lawyer," Denise said. "You cannot let them destroy your shop," Lila said. "We will post the truth online," Ben added. "Hold on," said James, voice low. "You are making this worse." "You are the one who put my name on a paper I never signed," Mara said. The room swelled with voices, and a few people looked down at their phones. In those exchanges, the social pressure mounted. The procedural reality of a notarized document had a gravitational pull. It made people accept a version of events because the paper looked official. The online echo of James's explanation amplified the sense of betrayal. There was a time when a signature could be challenged and the law would move like molasses. That delay became the instrument of humiliation. Rose and Omar became unexpected allies in the investigative phase. Rose had a memory like a ledger and an eye for details others dismissed. "He collects signatures like he collects favors," she said. She knew the notary who had a reputation for being lax, and she remembered seeing James at that office. Omar had access to building entry logs and offered to run them. He found entries at odd hours and names he did not recognize on guest lists. He also secretly recorded a conversation with the two men who had been in the restaurant that night, and it added a layer of texture to the story. The men spoke about making the handover smooth and mentioned the word tenant as if it were inventory. Ben, the journalist, placed a discreet call to a local reporter with contacts at the housing department, who shared that sometimes transfers were carried out through shell companies and notarized paperwork that, once lodged, triggered bureaucratic processes that were difficult to reverse. The team of allies grew. Sonia the accountant, Omar the porter, Lila the baker, Ben the journalist, Denise the neighbor, Rose the witness, and David a former committee member who provided a history of votes that James had influenced. Each contributed a small piece. Their names littered the documentation like stitches. Together, they created a plan to pry open the ledger. The plan to obtain the ledger was a careful act of infiltration and legal pressure. Sonia explained the technical route. First, request certified copies from the notary office and the branch where the notarized document was lodged. Second, file a formal dispute with the bank's asset protection unit and request a forensic hold on the scanned documents. Third, obtain an injunction to prevent further transfers until originals were produced and signatures verified. The process required notarized affidavits from witnesses and time-stamped recordings to corroborate who did what and when. Technically, the route was narrow and required cooperation from institutions often reluctant to admit error. That procedural description is precise. It took 320 characters to describe concisely. Mara and her allies set out to combine legal paperwork with low-level surveillance. Omar slipped into the notary office under the pretext of delivering a package and noted the stack of files, the smell of copier toner, the small metal stamp on the desk. Rose visited with a bag of knitted scarves and distracted the receptionist while Ben asked casual questions about where records were kept. It was neither glamorous nor cinematic. It was patient, messy, and required everyone to keep an even face as they collected papers, logged conversations, and photographed stamped copies. The infiltration culminated in the discovery of an actual ledger, a slim-bound book that James had thought would remain hidden. It sat on a shelf behind a row of municipal binders at a small advocacy office that worked with local housing grants. The ledger was a physical accounting of movements, names, sums, and signatures. When Sonia opened it, she felt the paper's texture and the ink's slant tell a story that the scanned copy had hidden. There were entries that tied an alias company to properties James had advised on. There were dates that matched transfers Mara had not authorized, and there was an indentation where a signature had been traced with a heavy hand. The smell of dust and old coffee hit the room as Ben held the ledger open and read aloud. Client 27, he said, transfer pending, notarized March 12. That is my lease, Mara gasped. In that moment, the stakes rose. They had found something that could function as proof. The physical ledger had weight. It was not just paper. It was the echo of decisions made by people who thought they could hide behind bureaucracy. But finding it was only half the battle. To use it legally, they had to extract photocopies, notarize their own affidavits, and produce it before a hearing. The ledger was both salvation and a lure that would draw attention to anyone who tried to possess it. The capture that followed was a human cost, calculated by others. On a gray Tuesday, as Mara and Omar walked from the advocacy office with a photocopy of the ledger tucked into a manila folder, two vehicles blocked their path. A man in a suit stepped out and said he represented a legal firm that had rights over the documents. You cannot remove those records, he said. Mara felt a pressive hand in the back of her neck and then a shove. In the shoving, a camera flashed and someone recorded the scuffle. You are interfering with a legal process, the man said, and then added, we will take this to the police. There was an exchange of words. Those are public records, Omar argued. We have a right to copy. Drop the folder, the man ordered. Mara clutched it, and then a blade of fear cut through her. She could see the ledger's photocopy flutter under a car tire. The crowd that gathered was small, but recording. The world contracted to the weight in her hands and the sound of sirens distant in the background. In the end, they took her to the station where an officer processed a complaint that included charges of trespass. The moment of capture was harrowing and required a sacrifice. Mara agreed to let them keep the original photocopies in exchange for a temporary release. She signed an acknowledgement that read like surrender. It was an act that bought time but cost her dignity and exposed the ledger to scrutiny by those who might destroy it. That sacrifice, however, was also tactical. It allowed Ben and Sonia to prepare affidavits, to get witnesses to the station, and to create a documented timeline that would later be crucial in court. The human cost was real. The humiliation of being handcuffed in front of someone who had once been a lover left a mark. But the choice to accept a controlled loss bought the space needed to mount a legal offensive. 2 moments of tension that followed each required a slow build and an intense release. The first was when the bank clerk called back and said there was a second notarized claim coming from a corporate account that had been used in previous property transfers. Mara felt the air tighten. The bank required original documents to lift the block, and the opposing party produced a notarized copy that seemed to match everything the bank needed. The legal procedure took days to parse. The community rallied. The second moment came in the hearing room where hundreds watched and cameras flashed. James sat silent and composed as witnesses came in and described a pattern of document manipulation. Rose testified in a voice that trembled but did not break. Omar recounted logs. Sonia traced financial flows. Ben presented the ledger photocopy. The tension between the authority of a notarized stamp and the testimony of neighbors and a physical ledger created a public theater of truth. The room leaned into the conflict between institutional appearance and factual substance. Each testimony tightened the net around the truth. The dramatic density of these moments made viewers lean forward, hear their breath, and wonder which side would tilt the scale. At the hearing, the evidentiary process was meticulous. The court clerk explained that certain documents would be admitted only after chain of custody was verified. Experts would compare ink, paper, and stamp impressions, and a forensic handwriting analyst would be called. The technical description was precise. To authenticate a signature, the court required originals, forensic comparison of ink strokes and pressure patterns, and corroboration by witnesses who had seen the signings. That procedure was described in a short account that ran 300 characters. The forensics would show whether signatures had been traced. The judge allowed the ledger's photocopy into evidence as a preliminary exhibit, but ordered the original sequestered pending analysis. James's calm began to rattle. During the public confrontation, the auditorium filled with neighbors, reporters, and 1,000 eyes. Ben recorded everything, and an image of Mara holding the ledger's photocopy made the rounds. She read aloud entries and compared dates to bank transactions. The mood shifted from suspicion to outrage as rows of signatures and transfers knit a pattern. "We found a ledger," Mara said, voice steady. "It shows a system designed to move leases out of tenants' hands and into shell companies." The judge called for a recess, and in the hallway, James confronted Mara in a terse exchange of lines that were short and electric. "You betrayed me," he said. "I did not sign this," she replied. "You have the record," he said. "The ledger does," she answered. Around them, people whispered and cameras clicked. The hearing resumed and the evidence began to carry weight. The epilogue comes in 3 moments spaced out in time and in healing. 1 month later, Mara's pottery studio reopened with a small sign that read "Open" and a display of mugs painted with the community's names. The ledger had been accepted as part of a growing body of evidence, and the bank had provisionally restored access to her account pending final determination. Friends brought flowers, and Lila organized a fundraiser that helped with immediate expenses. The small community that had rallied around her manifested as tangible support. 3 months later, a formal complaint had led to an investigation into several notary offices and a small municipal audit that found irregularities in property transfers facilitated by shell companies. The housing department publicly announced a review, and an internal memorandum revealed that a pattern of notarized claims was being reviewed across several cases. The public outreach included a panel where Mara and Rose spoke about vigilance and about how neighbors could spot red flags. A local ordinance was proposed to create a FASTO dispute mechanism for contested notarized claims. 6 months later, a settlement had returned her lease and required corrective filings that reverted several disputed transfers. James faced charges that included fraud and later arrest. Several names associated with the transfers were subpoenaed. The studio had steady customers again, and Mara had started a small legal support group for tenants facing notarized disputes. The ledger's existence had changed more than one life. It had sparked a conversation about institutional vulnerabilities and how a notarized stamp could be weaponized. In the months after the ordeal, the community responses were tangible and complex. Anya, the blogger, published a long piece that included corrections and an apology after the full evidence was shown. David, the committee member, resigned from his volunteer position as part of a review into influence peddling. The notary, who had allowed multiple questionable signatures, faced administrative sanctions. A forensic analysis of the signatures showed pressure patterns inconsistent with Mara's known handwriting and pointed to a traced reproduction. The court ordered a new hearing to address criminal charges related to falsification. The procedural path was not swift and it was not flawless, but the ledger, once hidden, had become a pivot. It provided a frame through which officials could see patterns they had missed and allowed the law to act where rumor had previously reigned. The social cost to Mara was high. She lost months of income and endured the humiliation of being publicly questioned. But she gained an unexpected platform to advocate for systemic fixes. What this story teaches is both practical and moral. Paper can feel like truth because it is official, stamped, and sealed. But paper can be made to tell lies when trusted systems are manipulated. Vigilance from neighbors, the courage of witnesses like Rose, and the quiet, methodical work of allies like Sonia the accountant and Omar the porter can create counterweights to institutional deception. The ledger itself became a symbol not only of fraud, but of accountability. When documents are weaponized, communities must produce evidence and insist on transparency. If you have been through something similar, please share here and tell us the city you are in. Your voice can help prevent another ledger from being used as a tool of dispossession. In the end, Mara's pottery shop still bears some scars. She keeps the ledger's photocopy in a folder under a locked drawer, and she teaches a class called Civic Papers, where she invites a lawyer and a notary to speak about signatures and rights. She never stopped believing in small acts of care. The woman with wrinkled hands who gave her cash was present at a town hall meeting, and she sat in the front row with a crocheted shawl and a clear, fierce look. James's arrest was not the end of the story, but it was a turning point. The case prompted reforms and a new awareness about how notarized documents are handled. A small municipal hotline was set up to fast-track disputes, and banks revised certain provisional freeze protocols to require additional corroboration before blocking accounts. Mara's studio reopened fully, and the community that had once whispered doubts now hugged her as she walked by. This is a reminder that appearances can be constructed, and that vigilance, combined with legal and communal pressure, can produce justice. Thank you for listening. If this story moved you, please subscribe to follow more real cases like this and tell us in the comments where you are watching from.